You are sacred. We are sacred.
So, hello everybody. Good afternoon from beautiful, warm, and sunny Tucson, Arizona. I'm here today recording this interview with my wonderful friend and spiritual brother, Gregg Braden. Welcome, Gregg, and thank you so much for spending this time with me.
Oh, Amber, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited, and I understand I'm your first in this new location, so I'm very honored to be the first.
Yeah.
Yeah, first times are always great.
First times are always great and always a learning experience, right?
Yeah.
So for people that are new to your work and perhaps new to me, I want to really just take a minute to read a few things from your bio because I'd like to get them familiar. As we were talking just a minute ago about our audiences, at least half of the people when we're in our travels are new to us, new to this work, and new to the new energy. So I want to give them a little clue about what's in store for us, okay?
Thank you very much. I'm excited to hear what you're going to say about me.
Yeah. Okay. Well, of course, you're a 5 times New York Times best-selling author, and you're an international pioneer, really, in bridging science, spirituality, and the human potential. And it just doesn't get any more exciting than that.
Yeah.
In your past life, between 1979 and 1990, you worked for Fortune 500 companies as a problem solver during times of crisis. And I think that's a particular good phrase, and we'll circle back around to that.
All right.
As you continue problem solving today, you use modern science and the wisdom traditions of the ancients that you have learned in your studies in remote monasteries and places all over the planet with the indigenous, and to help people come to those real world solutions. What I love about your work is that it's not just about thinking about stuff. It's like, what do we do in our life? We have information, now what do we do to change things? So 12 award-winning books published in 40 languages. Wow. And you've shared your presentations with the United Nations. That always gives me that feeling of hope in my heart. So that you've been there also I love that. And Fortune 500 companies, the US military. Now that, having seen you in person, I know the story behind it, but it's quite intriguing to think of the US military. They're not in the new age, but they're listening, and I love that. So we know you do interviews all the time and travel all the time, and you've been in the Watkins Journal as one of the top 100 world's most spiritually influential people for the 5th consecutive year. That's wonderful. And we know that our beautiful brother and friend Lee Carroll's in there with you in good. Yeah, so
Absolutely. Yeah.
And this year in 2017, you were nominated for the Templeton Award again. And let me pause in my talking for a minute just to hear you talk about the Templeton Award.
Oh, well, thank you, Amber. Well, it's, a lot of people in the US are not familiar with this award. It is both an award and a prize. 1978, Sir John Templeton, he was a philanthropist. If our listeners, our viewers, if they're familiar with the Templeton Fund, many people have their retirement 401ks, things like that, involved with the Templeton Fund. That was Sir John Templeton that started that. But he was more than an entrepreneur, more than a philanthropist. He's a deeply spiritual man. In 1978, he looked at the Nobel Prize in Science, and I think most of our viewers are familiar with that. And what he said was that Nobel Prize falls short of acknowledging the deeply spiritual aspect of the human experience. It was a mechanistic prize. It was based on the material world and the nuts and bolts of science. He said, but there's more to us than the nuts and bolts of science. He says there's a spiritual dimension that is lacking. So he established the Templeton Award to acknowledge one of the criteria is given to a living person. And I'm always honored to fall into that category, the category of a living person whose work has contributed through deed or information or thought to a greater understanding of the spiritual dimension of the human experience. So he pegged this award to the Nobel Prize financially. He said, the human experience, we have to be worth more than the material science. So wherever the Nobel Prize ends is where his prize begins. I was nominated in 2015, and the Templeton Committee accepted my nomination in 2015, which is a second step in the process. It is a 5-year standing nomination, Amber, and what that means is I am reconsidered every year for 5 years. And the reason I'm particularly excited, we're going to talk today in this conversation about new discoveries that have overturned 150 years of scientific thinking when it comes to us, our origins, our history, our destiny, our fate, our relationships to our own bodies, to one another, to the earth, to the cosmos, to God, to the future, to the past. Those new discoveries are based in peer-reviewed science on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's a reluctance to share them. In many cases, a resistance to sharing them in the mainstream. However, I am having mainstream teachers from primary and secondary education ask me to develop the curricula sharing the new discoveries so they can share this in their classrooms, because I cannot physically be present in every classroom.
Right.
So should I be blessed with this award sometime between now and the year 2020, that award, that prize is earmarked to fund the production of the new curricula that now is being asked for by the teachers themselves. And because we're talking to young people, we're talking to millennials and even younger, it's a very different kind of curricula from maybe what you and I are accustomed to. It is very digitally oriented, all based in video, non-technical language, beautiful images, but it conveys the primary essence of these new discoveries. For example, that nature is based in cooperation and mutual aid rather than competition and conflict, as Darwin proposed. That is a radically new way of thinking, and it is based in peer-reviewed science. We also know that that our lives are changing. We all know this. The world is changing, and the changes are being driven by a convergence of natural rhythms and natural cycles that typically are not acknowledged in the mainstream. They're economic cycles, climate cycles, and cycles of human conflict. We talked about this with the UN. So these kinds of things, once we begin to empower our young people with this knowledge, here's the key. The better we know ourselves, the less we fear change in our world, and the better we know ourselves, the less we fear one another as we go through the change together. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity. The world is changing, and we're not going back because there's nothing to go back to. The old world,
let's not go back.
yeah, well, the old world is gone. So all we can do now is move forward. The question is, how do we move forward in a healthy way? And I think the best that we can do is be honest with ourselves, Amber, about what the new discoveries are showing us now. Those discoveries, they may change 5 years from now, but this is what we know to be true through rock solid peer-reviewed science. Empower our young people so that as we emerge in this new world, so what's different now is that we are no longer living in isolated nations. We are globalizing 8 billion people, and we're witnessing a clash of cultures, belief systems, religion, culture, on every level. We've never done this before. The better we know ourselves, the more empowered we feel, the less we fear one another, and less we fear that change. And that's why I feel like this work is so vital. And I think that's one of the reasons our audiences are growing, not just in America. I'll be very honest with you, when we, and I say we, other presenters, Lee Carroll, Bruce Lipton, Joe Dispenza, we work together, and others, Dr. Todd, when we leave the borders of this big, beautiful, beautiful country of ours that I love so much, what I'm finding is that there's an even greater openness to embracing the new ideas that we're talking about right now. The world is ready for a new way of thinking, and I am honored to share what we now know to be true. It's not a hypothesis, it's not theory. These are scientific facts that help us live together as a global family in a healthy way, and that's the key. So, yeah, so that's what the Templeton Prize is all about. Thank you.
Woo! I say yes.
Yeah, well, I say yes
They
as well.
asked me to vote.
Well, even if the prize has not come through, the curricula is being developed. It's expensive. It takes longer, and this
Yeah, of course.
would jumpstart everything. But you know, one of the interesting things that we've found, and I find this really interesting, is that mainstream publishers are not interested in the new curricula. They say that they tell us that we're on our own for this. Publishing companies are not interested in developing curricula. So because it's not selling to the masses, it's selling to educational systems. So we're on our own doing this, and I'm excited about it.
I think they're being a little short-sighted, but that's just my opinion.
Well, mine as well. I share that with you.
Yes. I love this idea of knowing, the more we know ourselves, the less we fear others, because how different that is, 180 from what you and I were raised with.
Sure.
Being the same, not getting out of the box, and you know, coloring in the lines, and all of that whole paradigm. And it had nothing to do with finding out who we are and what our contributions can be to the world, and the gifts that the human life is.
Well, absolutely. Can I just share a quick story with you about what this comes from? A lot of our viewers. I wanted to say, first of all, hello to all of our viewers who are watching this. And I want to thank you all for sharing a few minutes of your life with me and with Amber today, the way that we are through this powerful new video media that I love to share with you. Many of you know that I do spend a lot of time out of the country in presentations, but I also have the honor of leading groups into some of the most ancient and mystical and remote and isolated and pristine places remaining in the world today. Places like Tibet and Egypt and India, Nepal and Bolivia and Peru. I was just coming back recently from a 3-week trip into Peru with a group, and I'd taken my group. They were on their plane on the way home, and I was coming from Lima, Peru, back into Dallas-Fort Worth Airport for the first stop here in the States. And I had been completely out of touch for 3 weeks with news. I didn't watch any news. I didn't watch any news. I had no, it was great. I had no idea what was going on. So as I was making my connection in Dallas, I was walking, those of you that know this, it was along the D concourse. That's the International Concourse. And I was walking along the concourse, passing various gates, and each gate had a news feed that was broadcasting loud enough I could hear it as I was walking. And some of them were different stations. So as I made my way to my flight back into Albuquerque, New Mexico, I was getting a fast catch up on everything I'd missed during the 3 weeks. And I got to tell you, it was scary. It's a wild world out there. And I was hearing everything from, a lot of it during this time was about hate, the hate crimes that were occurring not only in America, but in Western Europe as well. Hate based upon religion, hate based upon sexual orientation. People were being killed because of their sexual preferences. Hate based upon the color of our skin. And there was huge racial issues going on, particularly in the Midwest in the United States. I was hearing about genocides, ISIS, brutally. They weren't just killing people. People were already dead and they were still mutilating the bodies. I mean, all of this was this tremendous hate. And I was hearing about the United States and North Korea and about problems in the Middle East. And by the time I sat on my plane, I was just reeling from the catch-up. But here's what happened. As different as each of those news feeds was, there was a common thread through all of them. And the bottom line is that everything I was hearing was humans against humans responding to other people, humans responding to other people based upon the way they have been taught to think of themselves. So the way they think of themselves determined how they responded to other people through the hate, sexual orientations, religious, culture, genocides, you know, everything that was going on. It all comes down to the way we answer a single question, Amber. And I know many of us have heard this before. It's a simple, deceptively simple question. And it's simply, as individuals, we ask, who am I? Who am I as an individual? Who are we collectively? And this is where this program I'm doing with Lee Carroll, I think, is so important. And this is what a new book I have entitled Human by Design is all about. We are steeped in a scientific story that's about 150 years old, since the time of Charles Darwin in the mid-1800s. We're steeped in a story that tells us who we are. It's based upon information that we now know is no longer true. It's based upon separation, competition, conflict, struggle, scarcity, and we have embraced that story both subconsciously and consciously. And it shows up in our marriages, it shows up in our families, in our living rooms, it shows up
to ourselves.
Exactly, it shows up in the way we think of ourselves and the way we treat ourselves as we're going through issues, and it shows up on the world stage, because what's happening between the US and North Korea, or in the Middle East, or with ISIS in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever it is, that's people. Those are people dealing with people based upon the way they've been conditioned to think of themselves, based upon the way they answer, who are we? So when we lived in a world where nations were isolated, and we had isolated economies, isolated communications and defense systems and cultures and music, it was no problem. What happened is the world has changed, and we have leaders and individuals that are still thinking the way we were thinking when we were isolated. And this is the convergence of these new experiences, new ways of thinking. This is where the struggle is coming from. So new discoveries have overturned 150 years of the way we think about ourselves based on science. That's the good news. And you would think people would be thrilled to hear that. The flip side is there is a tremendous resistance in many instances. Academia, mainstream textbooks, mainstream classrooms, mainstream documentaries on mainstream television, they are not sharing the new story. And in many cases, they are, I'll give you a perfect example. There was a beautiful an 8-hour documentary on evolution. Beautiful graphics, beautifully portrayed information, where they systematically neglected to share any of the science that does not support the story that Darwin offered 150 years ago. So it was a beautiful mainstream documentary that cherry-picked the data and chose not to share the new information.
Well,
So,
it keeps the money in their pockets, and it keeps people afraid and against each other, and more easily controlled.
There are a number of agendas. I have friends. Well, I'm going to say this. I have friends in academia who are only my friends until we have this conversation, and then we were briefly not friends. No, a good friend of mine. I asked him. He's in university system in California, and he's a professor. And I said, why can't you share these new discoveries in your classroom? And he said, Greg, you don't understand. He said, if I shared the new discoveries, now I'm talking about paleontology and evolution, human evolution. He says, if I share, and we'll talk about these discoveries here in just a minute, but he said, if I share those new discoveries, he said it would invalidate my 40-year career of teaching. Oof. And I said, actually, I think it would do just the opposite. It would validate the power of science, because science is designed to be constantly updated with new information to keep it honest. I said, so you would be telling your students, you'd be demonstrating how powerful this living, changing body of information is. And he said, think how much money it would cost to change all the textbooks.
Exactly.
I said, no, I said, man, you're living in the dinosaur age, because your students aren't even using textbooks. If you change it on the server in one place, it's changed everywhere. He says, okay. He said, well, then I would have to go through and change all of my class notes that I've developed over the years. And
it's so inconvenient.
I said, that's what they're paying you to do. So but this is an example of the thinking, but there are, in many instances, science. Okay, I'm a scientist, and I'm a degree geologist with a strong background in life sciences, vertebrate, invertebrate biology, microbiology, organic chemistry. Science is good. Science does not have all the answers, and science can only be as good as we allow it to be honest. And in many instances, science now has been hijacked by corporations, by politics, by religion, and special interest groups, and they cherry pick the data so that the science appears to tell the story they support. Climate change is a perfect example of where this is happening. Evolution is a perfect example. So, this is why I think it's so important that we allow science to serve us by keeping science honest. And that's what we're doing. I will be doing with Lee Carroll in this event. We're sharing new discoveries that are simply not being shared in the mainstream. And I'm happy to talk about any of those with you today you'd like to talk about, Amber.
Yeah.
If you'd like to. Okay.
Well, I think it's, thank you for that, Greg. And I think it's what's kind of rolling around in me, and what might be helpful is that what you're saying is that we have the Darwinian model of competition, and that's reflected in our, it's not just in animals, it's us also. The model that you're talking about that really we see in nature is cooperation. And until we see that in ourselves, we're stuck in this old paradigm and this, not looking at who we are as people and possibilities. We're just living with blinders on in that, pushing against each other.
Do you mind, can I speak to that just a little bit, Amber? Are you okay with it?
Yeah.
I want to say, just to be very honest with our viewers, I'm going to talk directly to you. I want to be very clear on how I feel about Charles Darwin. Well, let me tell you a story. I was doing a radio interview on the new book, and we were talking about evolution and the new discoveries. And it was what we authors sometimes call a hostile interview, right off the bat, because there was no, good afternoon, how you doing, welcome to the program, or anything like that. The guy,
wow.
First thing he said to me, he says, "I don't buy it." And I said, "You don't buy what?" And he said, "I don't buy the story you're telling." And I said, "Have you read the book?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Well, so let's agree, number one, this is not an interview about the book because you haven't read the book." So I said, "What is it you're having a problem with?" He said, "What gives you the credentials to talk about human evolution?" He said, "When you're only a geologist, where do your credentials come from?" And I said, "Do you know what the profession was of the man who created the theory of evolution, Charles Darwin? Do you know what his profession was?" And the interviewer did. And I said, "He was a geologist." And he went right to, he says, "Okay, time for a station break." And he went to a break. And then he came back and he never said anything about it again. So Charles Darwin, let me just say this. Darwin could not possibly have known in his day, in the mid-1800s, what we know today.
No, of course.
He had in the 1800s, they didn't even know that DNA existed, number one. In the 1800s, they were thinking of human cells as little sacks of liquid in the body. That's all it was. So that's how far we've come in 150 years. Darwin was a scientist. I think he was a good scientist. And he never intended his theory to last forever. And he said that in his writings. I include this in my book, his actual statement. He said, "My theory is only good until new discoveries overturn my theory, and then my theory will fall." So he was okay if his theory fell. It's modern academia that is not okay. They have an agenda. They won't let that theory fall. Where I think Darwin made a mistake, in my opinion, is he looked at life in one place on the earth. It was on an island in the Pacific. So he looked at what was happening with life in one location on earth, in one moment in time for some forms of life. And he formed an opinion that he generalized to all forms of life everywhere on earth throughout all time, including humans. And it doesn't work that way. So So when I think of Darwin, I don't have anything against Darwin himself. A lot of people think I'm down on Darwin, and I just want to be clear that I'm not. I think he lived in a very different time. What I will say is this: I'm a geologist. Evolution is a fact. I've seen it in the fossil record for many forms of life, plants and animals. Evolution, as we have come to know it, is not the human story. And we can say that factually now because new technology regarding DNA analysis that we've never had before. It took me 32 years to write this book because it took 32 years for the technology to catch up with what the physical evidence was showing. And what we now know is that the DNA does not support evolution as we have come to understand it for the human existence, for human emergence. Now, I'm also going to say, I don't know personally. I have my own opinions. Scientifically, I cannot tell you where we did come from. I can tell you evolution is not our story. And I'm inviting the scientific and the academic world to free our young people in college today that are ready to devote their entire lives to the study of where we come from, free them from the shackles of an old story that's no longer true, unleash those brilliant minds, beautiful hearts, and all that passion. Let them, now here's the key, let them follow the evidence to whatever story it tells, rather than forcing them to force the evidence into a pre-existing theory, which is what we've done for 150 years.
Right.
150 years ago, Darwin said that we have evolved from lesser forms of life. Darwin didn't know where life began. He didn't care. His work was about what happened after the first life began, how we got from the simple to the complex beings that we are today. He formulated a theory of what's called evolution by natural selection, random mutations, slow, gradual, over long periods of time. And that theory is encapsulated in what is called the evolutionary tree of life. People see this, it looks like an oak tree. Modern humans are represented at the top, and then all these other Neanderthal and Australopithecus and Lucy and everything are on there, and they are supposed to be our ancestors. And we'll see this very clearly in the seminars that we do. If our viewers look closely, what they'll see is that the lines that connect us as modern humans to those other forms of life, they are not solid. They are broken lines. And the reason they're broken, Amber, is because there's no physical evidence that has ever been found in over 150 years to support that connection. The connections are believed to exist, and scientists say we simply haven't looked in the right place. But the physical evidence is taught as fact, yet there is no physical evidence to support that tree. Now, that's old news. We know that. And if that's all there was, I could not have written this book. The new news, and I love this, if our viewers saw Jurassic Park, the movie Jurassic Park,
Right.
it used to be science fiction. In Jurassic Park, they took DNA, they extracted DNA out of fossils. And in the movie, they reconstituted an entire being, a dinosaur, a Stegosaurus or a Brontosaurus or whatever it was. We now have the ability to extract the DNA from the beings that we believe are our ancestors. So we're extracting the DNA from fossilized remains of Neanderthal and Australopithecus and all of these, Homo habilis, all of that. And we're able to build their genome and compare their genome to ours. And this is where the new story is just blowing everybody away. This is like an earthquake with the epicenter squarely in the realm of biology and evolutionary science, because here's what it's showing is that we did not descend from Neanderthal, for example. We shared the earth with them. We walked the earth with them. They say we probably had Neanderthal boyfriends and girlfriends. We interbred with them. We did not descend from, we shared the earth with them. We could not have descended from them. But this is where it gets really interesting. There was another form of life, and I think our viewers have probably studied, it used to be called Cro-Magnon. That term is no longer used. It has now been replaced with an acronym, AMH, that stands for Anatomically Modern Human. And what the DNA analysis shows is that anatomically modern humans showed up on the earth. We appeared 200,000 years ago and have not changed since we showed up. We are the anatomically modern humans. We showed up 200,000 years ago intact, with the same bodies that they had 200,000 years ago, the same nervous system they had 200,000 years ago. The only difference they can find, Amber, is that our brain is more efficient. It's smaller. Our brain is smaller, but it has more folds that gives it more surface area for more neurons. The anatomically modern humans 200,000 years ago, their brain was a little bit bigger. It had fewer folds. So we can say that we have evolved a brain that is more efficient and more compact. But for all intents and purposes, they are us, we are them. We have not changed in 200,000 years. And that's not Darwin's idea of evolution. We did not appear slowly, gradually over a long period of time. So that's one discovery right there. And I'm going to share two more, but I want to take a breath here. And
yeah, that's a big one. So yeah, because that's our whole education is that evolution. And if we didn't evolve into the anatomically modern human, where did we show up from?
Well, this is where it's approaching what scientists now are calling forbidden territory. So the two questions are, why did it happen and how did it happen?
Right.
So scientists cannot tell us why. All science can do is show us what has occurred. Science cannot prove intent. So we don't know why scientifically. And again, I have some ideas of my own, but science can show us exactly how it happened. And this is the mind blower. We are the result of a fusion of DNA from other forms of life, other primates. The DNA has been fused in a very, very precise way. Now, I'm going to be honest and very, very fair. We do see genetic fusion happen in some forms of life on occasion. So I'm going to make the distinction. What's so unique about this? Human chromosome 2, perfect example. It's the second largest chromosome in the human body. It's about 8% of every cell in our body. It has over 1,200 genes on the chromosome, and I'm going to talk about only one. I mean, of the 1,200 that are there, they're doing amazing things. One gene, it's called TBR1, is responsible for our brain being 50% larger than our nearest primate relatives. It's responsible for what's called the neocortex in our brain. It's the most recent part of the brain. And for our viewers, if all this sounds really technical, let me just give you the bottom line here. This is the part of the brain that gives us our unique humanness. It allows us to have empathy, sympathy, compassion. It allows us, now here's the key, it allows us to self-regulate our biology in a way that no other form of life can do. Here's what I mean by that. We are the only form of life that can sit down in a moment in time and consciously say, in this moment, I choose to enhance my immune system, to make it stronger because I need to for whatever's happening in my life. In this moment, I choose to awaken the anti-aging enzymes in every cell of my body and actually become biologically younger than I was an hour ago. We can do that. In this moment, I choose to awaken the healing mechanism that allows me to heal almost instantaneously rather than the slow, gradual process that we've seen. In this moment, I choose to awaken the resilience in my heart so that I can deal with change in my life in a healthy way and not be inundated with the stress. We can do all these things. In this moment, I choose to awaken my deepest experience of intuition, deep intuition with myself, connecting me with other people in all forms of life. In this moment, I choose to access my subconscious without hypnosis so that I can change unhealthy patterns of my past, from my childhood or from trauma in my life. We're the only, and more, we're the only form of life that can do
all
this.
Of that in that little bitty package.
Okay, so that's only one gene.
Wow.
That allows us to do this. And if it were only that, Amber, we could say maybe it was the result of a rare fluke of biology, but it's not only that. Human chromosome number 7. I was a musician long before I was ever an author, and I still am. And one of the questions I've always had is when we look at other primates, we look at chimps, for example, we share about 98 to 99% of their DNA. I mean, very, very close genetically. So I've always wondered, why can't a chimp sing? You know, why can't a chimpanzee sing Stairway to Heaven? Well, how come I'm never gonna hear that? Here's the answer. Human chromosome 7. There was a shift, a very precise shift of two little DNA letters, 2 genetic letters, this reversal that allowed us the ability for complex speech and the ability, it connects our tongue and the muscles of our mouth and our brain in a way that no other primates have. And guess what? That shift happened exactly 200,000 years ago as well. We go back to human chromosome number 2. I mentioned that we do see chromosomes fuse sometimes. It's what happened after the fusion. After the fusion happened, there were overlapping functions that were either turned off or modified or removed altogether to streamline what was left. And what the scientists themselves say, they say these mutations I'm talking to you about, they cannot be the product of Darwin's idea of evolution as we've come to know it. Number one, it's the timing. Remember, Darwin said long, gradual processes, slowly over long periods of time. These happened very quickly, all at once, 200,000 years ago. The precision, the tweaking of the fusion and the shutting down or enabling of certain genes to streamline and stabilize that function. This is not a product of Darwin's idea of evolution. Something else happened. That's where the science has to stop. All they can say is this is not the product of evolution as we've come to know it. So you say, well, who did this or how or why?
Yeah.
I cannot say scientifically, but this is where every indigenous tradition that I have gone to, I've not been with every indigenous tradition in the world. Every indigenous tradition in the world I have been with, they all have a similar story. So, you know, if you go to the ancient Egyptians, they have their story. If you go to the ancient Sumerians, they've got their story. The ancient Hebrews have the Christian traditions have their story. The Hindu traditions have their story. The Aboriginals in Australia, they have their story. Science has had a story that is called evolution. And now DNA is telling us that there's a new story. And the common theme through all of these is that there has been some kind of an intervention from a higher power. So how we interpret that higher power, whatever we want to call that, but it is not the product of random mutations. I just want to give you an example. The very brilliant astrophysicist, British astrophysicist, his name is Sir Fred Hoyle. Fred Hoyle, for the non-mathematician, he said the odds of this happening are the equivalent of a tornado ripping through a junkyard of debris and creating a Boeing 747 on its way out. And we all know that's not going to happen. The odds of this happening mathematically are about 1 to 10 in the 600th. And the odds are so high scientifically when they reach a certain point that's said to be impossible. So it is scientifically believed to be impossible that we are the result. Now that we know what happened to the DNA, that tweaking of the DNA is not the result of a random mutation. There is something directed. It's called directed mutation is what it's called.
So it didn't happen by natural selection. It didn't happen to any other, there was no other input that we know of on this planet. So as a scientist, you may have one answer. As a spiritual person, you may have another answer. And does that include other planets' influences on us, or other galaxies, or other?
Well, this is, you know, the universal theme, and I'm just going to go back. When I spend time with indigenous peoples, and they share with me their information, it's not science. And as a scientist, I have to say that very clearly. It's not science. However, when a theme shows up commonly throughout indigenous traditions, there's generally some truth underlying that. For example, almost universally, there's a story of a great flood. And every indigenous tradition has their perspective of the people on Lake Titicaca in Peru, for example. They have their flood story. I live in northern New Mexico. The people in the Taos Pueblo, they have their creation story and their flood story. They're not identical, but they're talking about a common event that they all experienced. So there is some truth underlying their unique perspective. When it comes to where we come from, the universal theme is that we're not from around here, that there was an intervention of some intelligent life, whether we're going to call that God or whether we're going to call that ancestors from another world. The Sumerians have their story, and the Navajo and the Hopi have their story. But what's interesting is universally, all the stories say that we are the product of a group process. They say when they created the humans, when they created the humans. And what I find really interesting, when you go into the Christian texts, and I think most of our people who are watching us know that as good as the modern Bible is today, and it is a beautiful book, a beautiful work, we know that at times past, it was fleshed out with more complete information. Right. There were 43 books that were removed in the 4th century by the Emperor Constantine, not just for ours. In the Hebrew traditions, something very similar happened in the Hebrew Bible, not the Torah. The Torah is intact and has always been intact, but the books beyond the Torah, there were books that were edited as well. We know that because we have found these in the archaeological record. Here's why I'm saying this. When you go back into those pre-Christian and pre-biblical and the books of the Torah, of the Hebrew Bible, excluding the Torah that were edited, the common theme is that, okay, this is the way it's described, is that it took multiple iterations, multiple attempts of creating the human body before they found a genetic formula that was strong enough to hold the power of the human soul in this physical world. And almost universally, you see this in the Gnostic texts.
Right.
They created multiple beings before they arrived at us. The Mayan traditions go through all of the materials. They say the first humans, first we were created from a plant life, and then we were created from something else. It was only when we were created from the mud of the earth, the elements of this earth, that our body was strong enough to maintain the power of a soul in the physical and the material world. So that's not science, but it's a universal theme. We see it in the Gnostic text, we see it in the Christian texts that were edited, we see it in the Hebrew text, we see it in the indigenous traditions as well. So the common themes, number one, is that they always say they, when they created the first humans, whoever they are. Sometimes they are called angels in the Christian tradition. Sometimes they are called a greater intelligence in the Sumerian traditions. But when they created the humans, the first ones didn't work. And my sense is that those ones that didn't work are what we're seeing on that evolutionary tree. Right. Those forms of life that they were not sustainable in this world in the way that, and they died out because they were physical beings, but they couldn't hold the consciousness and the intelligence and the power that comes with the soul. So again, that's not science. That is my experience of being with the indigenous peoples, and also as a scholar, researching some of our most ancient and cherished spiritual traditions. There's a point, Amber, where the science can only tell you so much. And my sense is that if we allow the story, if we allow the science to show us, remember I said the two questions are, why did it happen and how did it happen? And we don't know the answer to why right now. But if we will allow the science to pursue how was that DNA fused? How was it modified? How was it tweaked? Where did that precision come from? It may actually lead to the why. So this is important because when we ask the question, who are we? I'm just going to go back. we've been taught that we are insignificant beings, that we are powerless from in our own body, powerless when it comes to us, powerless when it comes to the events of the world, that we're separate from one another. And people say, you know, okay, what's the big deal? You know, it's 1859. Well, the big deal is that in our insignificance and powerless, we have been taught to devalue human life. And we've been taught that the earth is not valuable as well. Now, maybe not you and me in our community,
Right.
but I'm saying society in general.
The majority, yeah.
In general, and that devaluing of human life is playing out right in front of our faces on the 6 o'clock news. Human life is being taken. It's being destroyed right in front of our faces faster than we can even document it. You know, there was an author in 1962. Her name was Rachel Carson. She wrote a book entitled Silent Spring, and it was one of the first environmental books about the pesticide DDT. And Rachel Carson made a statement in 1962 that applies to our lives today. She said, we only destroy the things that we don't value, and we can only value the things that we know and understand. Human life is being destroyed at an unprecedented rate right in front of our faces because we've been taught to devalue. We've been taught that we are insignificant, that we're the process of random mutations that just luckily happened, and that we're separate from everything. And here's why I'm saying this. If we're going to change the hate, if we're going to change the atrocities, if we're going to become the people and the societies we know are possible, we've got to get to the root of where the thinking comes from. And that's why this new work, I think, is so important. If we do anything else, Amber, it's a Band-Aid. All we're doing is putting a Band-Aid on the issues, a well-intentioned Band-Aid. You can pass all the rules in Congress you want about hate crimes. It doesn't change the way people feel.
Or build bigger prisons.
Exactly, because you're making it illegal to hurt other people, but you're not shifting the root cause. It's the way we've been taught to think of ourselves. So we have an opportunity now to raise an entire new generation of young people with the deepest truths of the best science of the modern world. And that science says that nature is based on cooperation, not competition. It says there is something very precious, very special, very unique about human life. And as we're taught to honor that, our thinking about genocide, about suicide, about right to life, about assisted suicide, about the color of our skin, about our sexual preference, about our religious preference, all those things begin to take on a new meaning because we're looking at them through a new lens. That is the value of this work. So this is the first part of the book. The second part of the book says, now that we know we're no accident, now that we know we're wired for these extraordinary experiences of tremendous human potential, how do we do it? How do we do it in our lives? And this is where the application comes in. And this is what I'm going to be sharing when I'm with Lee Carroll, January of 2018. And we're going to be talking about and actually experiencing the techniques that awaken these potentials in our lives. So I wanted to say all that so it doesn't get away.
That's wonderful. Well, so I am a very practical person as well as a very spiritual person, and that is what Lee and I do when we're on the road together. We were just in Philadelphia to a sold-out crowd, and it was amazing and energetic and wonderful that all these people are wanting to know. And that's part of the wanting to know is, okay, we know this stuff now. How do we apply it in our daily lives? We can't just fill our heads up with knowing or listening to channels when Lee does the channels. We're going to walk out the door. We're going to go back to work. We're going to have a conversation in the grocery store. We're going to, you know, a million things can happen. How can we be different? And KRYON says so many times, leave differently than you came. And what can we do to make that shift?
Well, it's a good question. And when we talk about an experiential process, it means different things to different people, Amber. Some people are so accustomed, when you say experiential process, they're locked into a box that says, okay, we're going to have a meditation. We're going to have a guided meditation, which is beautiful and can be very powerful for people. My experience, and this is the 33rd year that I've done this work in one form or another, is that when we discover something new about ourselves, the discovery is now in front of us, and we have to make a choice. We either discount that discovery and we leave the room, or we leave the computer screen the way we were when we sat down, or we embrace that discovery. And to embrace it means that we must make room in our emotional body and our consciousness for what we've just been shown. That means it has to displace something else that pre-existed, okay? So I think this is where the information, it doesn't have to be technical. You know, science is simple until we make it technical. Scientists, I've worked with science engineers all my adult life, and they pride themselves often on using a language that nobody else understands. That's a very exclusive, it's an exclusive club.
Yeah.
And that's cool. You know, you can do that. However, if your intent is to empower a broad general audience with something new about themselves, my question is, why not just share it in plain language so that everyone could benefit? If they want the mathematics, if they want the technical jargon, it's available. But just talk to people about what these discoveries mean, and that's what we're doing. So the new discovery, it begins with shifting our thinking. And once we realize that we are literally wired to thrive in change, that we are wired for resilience, that we are wired to regenerate, we are wired to rejuvenate. I mean, that is a huge shift right there. If you say it to people, they're not going to get it. If you show them why they are wired, why their bodies are uniquely designed, and how we have a potential that may be awakened, then they will say, how do I awaken that potential? Now you're ready for the technique. If you simply go in and say, do these things, it doesn't have the same meaning. We're not honoring the left brain and the right brain. So this is why new information is important. It doesn't have to be technical. It doesn't have to be complicated. And I'm a very visual person. I like little movies that show how things work, and we create those in the programs. Number one. Number two, this is where science gets stuck sometimes, because, and I'll give you a perfect example. In 2006, 2007, I released a book entitled The Divine Matrix. It was a book encapsulating the science that shows us that everything is connected and that we are part of that connection. 2006, 2007, it was considered fringe. It was actually, they would put it at the back of the bookstore, like in the occult book section in 06, 07. Let me show you how far we have come. Now we are in 2017, and it is accepted in the broad general audience, mainstream audience. Of course, everything's connected. Of course, there's a field of energy out there. And that book became a New York Times bestseller. It is now actually required reading in some university physics classrooms, and that happened in about 10 years. All right. So we're just a little ahead of the curve on where that is. Here's what happened. And Lee Carroll does this. Joe Dispenza does this. Bruce Lipton does this. I've done this. We've all been in the corporate world. We've all been in academia. We could have stayed in those worlds and gone through those channels to release the new information, and very few people would see it. It would be relegated to obscure journals in technical language. We chose to take very solid research and share it with the broad general audience, a mainstream audience, to the best of our ability. And when new information comes up, we're happy to share that new information. And if it changes what we used to believe, we're happy to share that as well. We're happy to be honest about it. So when it comes to the things we're talking about, we're asking people to think about their bodies so very differently than what we've been conditioned to believe. And as we embrace that difference, then it makes sense to embrace the techniques as well. Science can only tell us how things work. When I'm with my indigenous friends, and I'm with the monks and the nuns and the abbots and the shamans and the healers and the curanderos in the monasteries or in the villages or wherever it is, in the Andes Mountains, wherever it is, this is the difference in our cultures, Amber. It's so beautiful. Science has taken 300 years to arrive at the place showing us we are empowered. These indigenous perspectives, they began 5,000 years ago accepting that we are empowered. For 5,000 years, they didn't have to prove it. They devoted their time to developing the techniques. How do they apply it in their lives? So I can share the science, and then I can share what I've learned from being with the monks and the nuns, the techniques they use. For example, we're taught to think of the heart and the brain as two separate organs in the body, independent of one another. It's true that they are physically separate. However, it's also true that these two separate organs may be harmonized and tuned into a single potent system. And when we do that, we awaken so many of the extraordinary abilities, the extraordinary potential that we used to believe was only relegated to yogis and mystics, you know, on a mountaintop halfway around the world in the Himalayas, in an isolated existence where they have given away all their possessions and walked away from everything they love to develop these techniques. You can do that, and that's cool. There's nothing wrong with it. But
No.
you can also do it in your living room right now, because we understand this process. So this is where it begins, when we start thinking about the heart and the brain as a single system rather than two separate organs.
So Greg, in our last few minutes here
Oh
together.
wow, are we that fat? Are we? Oh my gosh, this is going by really
I know, time flies when we're having fun together. You, I believe, will talk about how to do some of those things at our Longmont event.
We're going to do it. We're going to go beyond talking about it. We're going to do it.
We're going to do it. Oh,
Yeah.
yay. All right. So that's exciting, because that's what we need. We need the facts, and then we need the practical application. And I think the way that you teach is always, it's always so fascinating, and it really surrounds these parts, the science, the spirituality, and I love that part about the human potential.
Yeah.
Because that's where it takes us.
Well, Amber, what I want to say, now that this potential is being acknowledged, this is so new. I mean, this is so new. It's not even the mainstream right now. But the techniques we're going to be learning in our classroom, and it wouldn't do any good for me to come and share my time if I couldn't share the techniques. So I want everyone to have the experience. This stuff is being taught now in the intelligence services. U.S. CIA uses these techniques to hone the perceptions of those people in the field. The U.S. military, all 5 branches, and I'm saying 5 because there's the U.S. Coast Guard, are all using these techniques. First responders, fire, police are using these techniques to hone their resilience to what they face every day in their lives, to protect our country and to protect their own lives and their families, both going into as well as after they've had the experience. U.S. military, the U.S. Olympic team is using many of these techniques to hone their abilities to function optimally at high levels of intensity. So what I mean by that is you don't have to be in a totally restful, blissed out state. At very high levels of heart rate, very high levels of energetic output, you can be very highly tuned. I've been a martial artist since I was 14 years old. Use this stuff in martial arts. I've been a yogi since 1986. Use this stuff in yoga. So these techniques, they have a lot of very practical applications. It's about us learning to be the best that we can be and creating the best world that we know is possible, beginning by honoring our origin and our history and the deep potential that lives within us. So it is all about human potential. Once we have it, then each individual can determine how they want to apply that in their lives. How do we awaken this potential? And that's what's exciting for me, because this isn't, I have people, I just came from a conference, 2,000 people in Mexico City. And we had medical doctors from the United States and South America and Mexico in that conference. And they said, how come we're not learning this in medical school?
Good question.
This is how leading edge this is. So I'm honored to share the stage with my dear brother, Lee Carroll, who I have known for, we've lost track. We know it's over 20, almost 25 years. To be there with you, to be there with our awesome people in beautiful Colorado in January, where the air is cool and crisp and thin, and the skies are blue, and we're in the mountains.
Start the new year together. That's
Yeah.
with all of these exciting new pieces of information. Thank you so much, Gregg, for your time and for your devotion to spirituality, science, and the human potential. And I really look forward to seeing you.
I'm looking forward to it as well, Amber. What you haven't said to our audience, and I want them to know before we leave here, is that you are the woman who has made this possible. You're the one that has put this conference together. You're the one that has invited me to come and participate. And I want to thank you for your vision and your dedication and your perseverance to keep this happening. I appreciate you tremendously.
Well, you and Lee make it a pleasure and an honor. And this work is an honor in every way. So I look forward to seeing you in January.
See you in a few weeks. Take care.
Thank you to everybody listening. Please come on to Lee's website, my website, Amber Wolf PhD, to see more about this event. Thank you.